All right. Now that we have all our panelists here, I think we're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute.
Okay.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us on this rainy Saturday morning. It's great to have you all here. My name is Haling Price. I'm a student here at the Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Business School. It's my pleasure to join you for our 10th annual Black Policy Conference. We have a number of panels and events scheduled for today, and just as a matter of housekeeping, men's room right out the door here, ladies' room across the hall. I know there are a lot of folks interested in joining the mental health discussion next door as well. So two things. One, that both will be recorded, taped, available online later. But we also do encourage you to sort of cross-pollinate. And if you feel, the spirit moves you to sort of mosey on over, we won't take it personally. So I think just to tee things up and put it into context of the larger conversation, yesterday we heard a lot about sort of the landscape of opportunity in Black America across health, juvenile justice, and education. And one thing that became sort of a recurring theme was the notion of doing more for our young people outside of the classroom. And as we know, there are so many touch points where we can meet needs for children beyond sort of formal instruction, right? So thinking about the proliferation of community partnerships and private, nonprofit, and government interventions that have begun to target this work, we're interested in kind of going a bit deeper, given this context, and adding some nuance to the conversation about what it takes to really make a difference for young folks outside of the classroom using sort of evidence-based, data-driven approaches. Something of great interest here. I actually have a research colleague here. We've having a lot of conversations this semester looking at this work, both at the Kennedy School and sort of in the policy community at large. And it's really exciting to have some folks here who are interested in kind of going a bit deeper. So I won't belabor the point. We have the experts seated here right next to me. But with that, just wanted to introduce the panel briefly. So to my left is Liz Dozier, who's the principal of Fenger High School out in Chicago Public Schools. And some folks may know her now as a regular on, I guess, cable TV. She is one of the stars of CNN Chicagoland miniseries. It's an 8-part documentary series where she's being featured alongside other luminaries in Chicago for the great work they're doing to move the needle for our young people. So we're very excited to have her here today. Next is Melissa Jones from LISC Boston. That's the Local Initiative Support Corporation. Yes. Melissa's had the unique experience of being on both sides of the funding equation. First, building programs out in Oakland, was it Youth Uprising? Mm-hmm. And now funding community partnerships and managing the Resilient Communities, Resilient Families program here at Boston LISC. To her left is Isaac Castillo, who is the Senior Director of Data and Evaluation at the DC Promise neighborhood. Isaac and I first met when he was at Child Trends, also doing great evidence-based work around youth outcomes, and since then it's been a real treat to follow his work managing data and thinking about how to break these institutional silos we'll be discussing through the DC Promise neighborhood. Finally, real pleasure to have Michael McAfee. We talk a lot about scale here. It's an elusive question and one that's always salient with policy, and Michael has as a distinction of being the director of the Promise Neighborhoods Institute at PolicyLink. So he is helping build and manage a community of practice of promised neighborhoods around the country. And for those who aren't familiar with the program, we'll get into that in a moment. But thinking about how to really build capacity for this burgeoning field and move the needle, and I think get into some really fundamental questions about the way capital flows in our communities. He's been a great thought partner over the years, and it's great to have you here. So with that, kind of want to start with the federal context. Again, the conference is about Black and Obama's America. So I know a lot of us in DC were thinking deeply about what opportunities existed with the new administration to really build partnerships across school lines and think about the role of community in that space. Michael's been privy to this conversation from the very beginning, and I think your vantage point at PolicyLink is a really critical one. So interested to hear kind of how this work is taking shape on the federal level, what sort of historical and theoretical precedents there are for this, and kind of where you see things going forward.
Great. Good morning. Good morning. So I would say the work has been more than 40 years in the making. Yes, the work has been more than 40 years in the making. Actually, the Obama administration has been really good at lifting up what we at PolicyLink call the voice, wisdom, and experience of local communities. The Promised Neighborhoods effort really comes out of the work in the Harlem Children's Zone with Jeff Canada's work, really trying to figure out how do you begin to put comprehensive community supports in place for children from cradle to career. If you read Voices from the Field 3, which is really a really good meta-analysis of where what I call the community building, community change field has been, you will see in there that we've often lamented that while we fantasize about population level results, we often don't build the systems to actually get them. So we'll invest in early learning and then forget about kids in middle school, and so on. And so Promise Neighborhoods was an opportunity to stop that at the federal level. It was an opportunity also to do a couple of other things, to begin to think, can we listen to that voice and that wisdom and that experience and actually do a couple of things differently? Can we begin to break down silos among the federal agencies? Can we really build strong systems of support infrastructure that's necessary at the local level? Can we begin to even think about talking about what does it take to get results at the national level? So that was the desire that came out of what the president started in his first administration called the Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative, trying to figure out, in a few places, can we make progress at scale? And that continues today. You've seen a couple of iterations in the second administration, in the second term. You've seen things like Promise Zones. You've seen things like My Brother's Keeper. But at the end of the day, no matter what you call it, the work is still the same. And this is, to me, what is most important. If, in fact, we can't build the infrastructure to accelerate local leaders' ability to get results and actually tell stories of making progress, it is really just marketing. And so I'm holding, and the reason why I'm being that direct is because I believe that we've learned enough over the years now that if, in fact, we can't produce results, it's a big so what. And so I think the conversation at the national level is really about that right now. What is the appropriate federal role for having a point of view about this work? Oftentimes we'll say to folks, local communities know best. City, counties, and states know best. And I totally agree with that. But I think when it comes to addressing issues of poverty, your role as a policymaker, your role as a leader is actually to have a point of view about the work and to advance it. It doesn't mean that you don't do that in partnership with other people. But if you really think that you're just going to come up with a framework and just throw it out there into the universe and that somehow will make people organize differently, that will somehow make people do the adaptive work that is necessary to achieve results at a population level, I haven't seen that happen. And so the push is to say to the federal government, can we figure out a way to have a point of view about this work that still allows the local creativity on the ground to flourish, but that we aren't fantasizing. We do have a point of view about results. We do have a point of view about when we want to achieve those results. We do know the types of capacities organizations and systems have to deliver those things. And that we can have a strong point of view about and lead on. And so at the Promise Neighborhoods Institute at PolicyLink, we're working with the administration to encourage the point of view that you hear me advancing. And then the federal government is trying to figure out through specifically the Department of Education how they can actually take this voice in from the community and figure out how does that get translated back out into policy. So that is the work right now, figuring out how do we scale what we know works, do so in a way that we are actually helping poor communities find their own pathways out of poverty.
Thanks, Michael. And I think one of the most promising, to use the term, promising sort of laboratories for this work has been in Northeast DC in the Parkside Kenilworth neighborhood where Isaac's currently working. I think they've had the privilege of being in the backyard of the federal government, so they've also sort of been a darling of the administration. It's been, again, great to watch that grow. So where do you see kind of the rubber meeting the road around this disconnect maybe between frameworks, practitioners, and if you can chat a little bit about how that played into the origins of the DC Promise Neighborhood?
Sure. So the DC Promise Neighborhood Initiative, so DCP&I is going to be the acronym you're going to hear me use a lot. DCP&I started actually fairly recently in December of 2012. We were a new organization that was created because of the funding. We were one of 12 implementation grantees that gets funding from the Department of Education to be a Promise Neighborhood like Michael talked about. And I think where we're approaching all of this work is we're trying to look at it at two different levels. We're trying to look at sort of the community or policy or local government sort of lever initiative. So how can we create community level change for our Promise Neighborhood? How can we deal with things like crime rates, with poverty or income levels, and make that change at the community level? But we're also trying to make change at the individual level. And when we talk individuals in our community, we talk about students and we talk about our parents. We're very cognizant of having a two-generation model because we believe that in order to have true success, long-term success for children, we need to get their parents on board and have the parents succeed as well. And so our approach, our model when we talk about proving results, as Michael talked about, is let's get results for the community, but that work starts with getting results for our children and for our parents. And it's not just academic results, it's also results to make sure that they get what they need to be able to succeed anywhere, in anything that they want to do. I'll give one example. We did a large data collection event in October of 2013, fairly recently, and we found that 49%, half of our residents were defined as food insecure, which means that they're going to bed hungry almost every single night. Half of our residents. We as an organization, we as a leader in the community have to do something to address that, because if people are hungry, they're not going to learn, they're not going to increase their employability skills, they're not going to be able to get jobs, they're not going to be able to go to college. That is such a huge barrier. And as much as we want to talk about improving academic outcomes, if people are going to bed hungry, they will not learn. And so our work is trying to identify not only how can we make better academic outcomes for our community, but what are the other things that are related that are outside the school day, outside the normal academic structure, and how can we get services, resources to our community members to support them in getting those outcomes achieved and stabilizing the other things so that they have the opportunity to learn, have the opportunity to grow, and to put themselves in a better place economically.
Thanks. So Melissa, you've had a really unique vantage point. We were discussing earlier in the panel, there aren't a lot of folks who have sort of been writing the grants, but also sort of deciding who gets the funding from on high. I think it's a really unique perspective.
Moderately on high, maybe.
Yeah, but I know LISC DC was also a partner of DCPNI's, right? So definitely nationally partnering with a lot of these initiatives. So from your perspective, I think there's an important case to be made around sustainability. We talk a lot about the administration support, but I think we'd obviously like to see viable funding beyond sort of 2016, right? So what does that look like for you? How do you see the funding community taking advantage of this work? And more broadly, based on your experience, kind of program implementation, what are the implications there longer term?
Okay, so am I okay on the mic? Yes. So I am, more than anything else, I believe that implementation is the key. And so I think when we implement projects, we implement them well, or when we find out a policy isn't working and we remember that our commitment is to the community anyways, and we figure out how to implement either around it or through it and then change it, it's exceptionally important. And I think at this point, we know a lot of things generally, right? So we know generally, and it makes a lot of sense to us both in data and in our lives, that it matters that kids aren't going to bed hungry and they aren't coming to school hungry. Right? We know that matters. We know it matters that kids feel safe when they walk to school. We know it matters that kids aren't stressed and worried about their safety when they're in a classroom. We know it matters that families don't have to move around a whole lot. We know in general that matters for what happens to kids. But what we don't always have good systems for on the ground is figuring out those general things matter, but what matters most here in this moment in this place. And then how do we make sure that we can deliver on the promises we need in those places? And so LISC has been doing community development work for a long time. How many people know LISC? Just so I don't go too much into something everybody knows. That is always the hands about the number, right? So LISC is actually a community development intermediary. It's the largest one in the country, but people haven't necessarily heard about it if they don't focus a lot on affordable housing. And LISC has focused over time in making sure there's affordable housing out there at different income bands, and that really has an impact on how often families who are in that housing have to move. They have to move less than other families. And as long as we have a system with as unequal a set of wages as we have, a lot of people in affordable housing are working. It's a little bit of a myth that that's not the case. As long as we have the wage disparity we have a need for housing at different income levels, especially in cities that have gotten increasingly popular. So LISC has done that work for a long time. LISC actually helps community development corporations and other affordable housing providers get the land they need in the first place to get the housing built. And then the early costs, which are the riskier costs that people don't like to finance, LISC helps finance so that affordable housing can get built. But LISC has been about neighborhoods, and neighborhoods are about more than housing. And so there's things we've done over the last few years to really get to the heart of other issues. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of things we know work, and then talk a little bit about how these can work in the longer term. So thinking just about youth services, right? People think if we want to support schools, basically what happens with schools is, people have heard this quote, it's not your fault, but it is your problem, right? There are all kinds of things that happen in communities that are not one particular person's fault, but we live with the repercussions of the problem. And so the question is, what can neighborhoods do to think about it's not your fault, but it is your problem. And so how do we fix it so that schools don't have so many issues that aren't their fault, but are the problem for the young people in the building? And so one is basic facilities, right? Do you have some place where kids can play outside after school? LISC has done a lot of financing around with the NFL around field space. So multi-purpose, big fields where you can play football, soccer, a range of things, really get active, be active, have a space in the community to go. We've done financing for charter schools who generally don't get facility supports through school districts for all of the reasons many of you probably know. That's the youth side. People think of that first. And then people think about safety. And so one of the things we spend a lot of time helping people think about is how you do police-community partnerships. And I actually think police and community are increasingly better at this than they get credit for. But we've done a lot of work. So one of the things we heard in our neighborhood planning is that there was a block where kids are walking to school and young girls are being propositioned around prostitution. Obviously, that's one of our goals, is for that not to happen, right? So the question is, how do you avoid it, and why is that happening at all? And so we worked with the police to really raise that as a priority issue. Sometimes for police officers, prostitution is not a priority issue. It's just not. And so we talked about why that's a priority and why it's a problem. And when they heard young girls were being propositioned on their way to school, it really mattered. And so one of the things we did with them is to work a series of John stings so that people were afraid to go there and proposition girls, right, to redirect what was happening. And then on the but the thing that people don't think as much about that we can really have an impact on at a neighborhood level is economic development. And so we've been doing quite a bit over time in terms of financing economic development projects at a neighborhood level. So what we know is that businesses that operate in neighborhoods are most likely to hire people from neighborhoods, right? And so we've done a number of things in terms of supporting business incubator space, which the trick of that is it keeps overhead lower for businesses. They share the space so that more people can be employed at lower cost rates. Thinking about business attraction and anchor institutions, which you guys probably talk about a lot, right? There are a lot of things that local institutions source, particularly big institutions like universities, hospitals, other centers. And so thinking about what are all the things they buy and where do they buy them from? And if they're not buying them locally, why not? And if they're not buying them locally because businesses aren't at the scale they need to be, how do you help those businesses get to that scale? And if they're not buying locally because those businesses aren't there, are there ways to pull together a coalition to make those businesses happen? And then health, of course, there's been a lot of work around putting school-based health centers inside of schools so that children can get either behavioral health or physical health services that they need. So all those things we know we can do, and some of them are more expensive than others. So the question is, how does a neighborhood attract in all the resources it wants to wrap around kids? Right? That is the tricky question. So LISC has been supporting community organizing in a number of cities where we work by funding full-time organizers to bring coalitions together that include nonprofit organizations that might serve one of those particular function areas, and then also residents to do really deep community planning. Because sometimes what I think happens is you have nonprofit organizations focus in a particular strategy area and know that area well, and so you might get good service in that area, but you've got 5 other things that matter to kids, neighborhoods, and schools that aren't being functioned and focused on. And so residents will fill in for you what those gaps are that the organizations might not be thinking of. And then you can really put together a strategy that's an inside and outside strategy of attracting resources to the neighborhood and getting resources out to the neighborhood. I think the thing we're missing in terms of a long-term strategy is having all of those groups connect in order to really have policy advocacy so that you're not fighting over resources. So that, and we have some work to do, I think, on the side of people who care about neighborhoods, and particularly low-income neighborhoods, have some work to do to find our common ground with the other side, because the fact that we're arguing now over whether or not programs that provide food stability, right, to families is a worthwhile expense tells us we have a lot of work to do to figure out how to have more bipartisan coalitions.
Thank you, Melissa. That's very helpful. I think looking at sort of the community-based coalitions, there is a lot more conversation, as you can hear, around schools going beyond just sort of the formal educator, custodial care role, and thinking about how to integrate the value they offer in a community with a broader network of support. So Liz, very interested to hear more about why just good teachers aren't enough and what needs you see, and sort of how the partnerships that Melissa just described would really add value in your school.
So, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
You can do better than that. I'm a principal, so good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, there you are. Just to touch base on a couple of quick things that I think are important, I agree with everything that the panel stated. I think that the social and psychological and social, emotional, and physical safety of children has been for us really paramount in terms of determining whether or not children will succeed or not. And so for us, it is critical to have that, again, that partnership with not only just the community, with the police organizations, but also with community partners, so parents, folks in the community, to actually make sure kids get to and from school safely. And all that might sound like very small or trite. It's a huge issue for us and a determinant of success, because if kids don't feel safe to get home to and from school, they won't come to school. And so if you look at Finger historically, which is the school I'm currently at, if you look at Finger historically, you'll see attendance rates in the 40s and 50s in terms of percentile of kids coming to school every day. So we can't even begin to talk about having kids be successful if we can't get them in the building. And so for us, that's really huge. I think a second key factor for us is that psychological safety and that social emotional support. And so we have to offer, and we proudly offer, anger management, grief counseling, trauma therapy within the course of the school day that kids, can self-select into, or teachers will recommend them to go into these programs. And they're, usually 8 to 10 week programs, and kind of we group them almost like group therapy, if you will. And that's really critical for us because the community in which my school operates has a lot of violence within it, and so I often find it so interesting, like, soldiers will go off to war and then we provide them all these supports, but we have kids who are living in war zones and we just expect them to just come to school and do their math and reading and just function completely normally without ever taking into consideration like the trauma and stuff that they experience. And so that's been another really key for us. I think teachers are so critical, and I know that they're not the sole part of the solution, but I think they're huge. And for me, they're huge because they build those relationships. And what I've seen, what really moves children from maybe a point A to a point B. So I think of my student, Veda, who is now away at college, who, if you would have looked at her 5 years ago, you would have been like, she is not going to make it, because she would come to school and she would just, get involved in physical altercations with other students, just a whole bunch of issues and problems, failing most of her classes. But it was the relationship she had with her teacher that gave her a new kind of lease on life and really inspired her to want more for her life. And through that relationship developing over the course of 4 years, she's now away at college because that teacher was able to inspire something within her. And so I think there's the role of the teacher in terms of the curriculum and the teaching and learning in that aspect, but there's also that healthy adult relationship that needs to be kind of developed and nurtured that will be the determinant and will kids be successful or not? And I think especially in some of our most challenging schools, that relationship can't be taken for granted. A lot of times in, maybe another context, children have relationships with, parents or with, other people within their community. But a lot of times within our context, like this teacher or the social worker or the counselor or the main office clerk or the security officer becomes that really motivating and guiding factor. But I think the thing that most determines, or one of the things that can definitely most determine success, is something that happens like way before students ever get to me, like 13 or 14 years before they ever get to a high school. And it's high quality, like early learning programs, it's food and nutrition, it's healthcare, it's reading, it's does a child feel safe within their home, do they have access to the internet? All these things like matter in terms of children developing along the way. So let me say one more thing before I go. One more thing. One of the things that we do that I think is so important is teaching the kids how to actually resolve their own conflict. And so we do a lot of work, a lot of restorative justice work. We do a lot of peace circles, a lot of peer jury. I think sometimes in schools overall, like it's kind of this top-down approach with children instead of teaching them how to resolve their own conflict and their own issues. And so for us, if you just look at our misconducts where we had over, I think, 300 arrests inside the school building my first year there, about a little over 4 years ago. And now that's down by like, I don't know, it's 95% or something. And I think a lot of that has to do with, because the same issues are still there. I mean, we still have, gangs within the community and these types of things, but it's really helping the children help resolve their own conflicts. They feel empowered and they're not, kind of being put upon.
Powerful. So we hear a lot about the notion and the role of partnerships, and I think it can become an abstraction that can be more of an obstacle than a real vehicle to progress. So I'm interested in going a little deeper on what that really means. I remember a really interesting experience we had during the sort of the planning phase of DC Promise Neighborhood. So the school, you have to understand, in the neighborhood of Parkside Kenilworth is in a food desert, as you heard, geographically isolated in a lot of ways. Outside of the school, young folks don't really have many places to go, with one notable exception. There was a guy who ran a youth center named Mr. Chick. Does this ring a bell, Isaac?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just remember.
Mr. Chick's really happy you dropped his name.
Yeah, that's right. And if you wanted to find the young people outside of the school, you had to go to Mr. Chick, and that's where we ended up having a lot of the focus groups and needs assessment components. So I think the question is, how do you operationalize partnerships when so many of these relationships are informal? And what does it look like when you are engaging with more established institutions?
I think for us, when we talk about really operationalizing partnerships, it's creating a goal or a vision, something that these partners can rally around. I think 99% of people in sort of the nonprofit, direct service, education communities, their heart's in the right place and they want to help people. But the problem is that many times don't know what they want to contribute or exactly how to help or even what the end game is supposed to look like for their interventions. So we often, with our partners, engage in conversations and I ask them flat out, what is your definition of success? I know what you do. I want to start with what your definition of success is for your participants and align that with our larger goals and larger vision of community-wide change within the Promise neighborhood. So if you define success in one way and it's very well aligned with some of our indicators, with our larger vision, then that's great. We can have you as a partner. We can help you get to where you need to get to achieve good outcomes for your participants. Oh, and we're going to introduce you to other partners within our sphere that have the same definition of success and have the same definition of approaches and encourage some peer learning to go about. Where I've traveled a lot across the country and across the US and Canada and talked to a lot of nonprofits, and when I hear them struggle is when there's a lack of definition as to what success means and what it looks like. So our partnerships are very much focused on first defining what success is. And then once we've defined that, it's helping them to measure the effectiveness of their interventions. Because I think another place where direct service agencies and some schools and some even local government struggle is proving that what they do works and that it's effective. I wrote a short essay in a book called Leap of Reason a couple of years ago, and I told a story, and I asked people to think about this when you're working in the field as a policymaker or providing direct service to participants. How do you know that you're not causing harm to people, right? Everyone has the best of intentions, but no human being is perfect, no programmatic approach is perfect, no policy is perfect. There is going to be error that is going to be made, and people are going to be harmed by it. And what should keep everyone up awake at night, it keeps me up every night, is how do you know that your policy, how do you know that your proposed program, how do you know that your initiative is not the one that's causing harm? Mm-hmm. My primary role at DCP&I is to help our partners first prove that they are not harming their kids. If we can do that, great. Now let's start talking about getting interventions that can provide positive outcomes. But no one ever stops to think about, am I the one that's actually doing harm to our children, to our participants, to our kids? I need to switch that mindset first amongst our partners and then get them to think about how do we do more effective interventions and improving from year to year. So as part of the process of working with us as a partner, we collect data with you and in partnership with you and collect data that you can utilize. And we sit down and we have conversations about this data. Why are you getting better outcomes for your females versus your males? Why you seem to be doing a better job with 12-year-olds versus 11-year-olds? I don't know that. I'm not the expert in providing those services, but I can look at the data and interpret it and then ask you questions as the expert as to why you think this is happening. Now let's talk about the next programmatic cycle, how we can make changes, how we can provide you more support so that you can get better outcomes for those populations that you're struggling with. And that's the key that's really underlying all of the partnership work that we're doing, and I think the key to our success.
Michael, I think you see a lot of variation from one community to another, and I think DC's been very successful, but interested in your perspective kind of on the 30,000-foot view of how this takes shape in separate communities, what sort of trends in terms of impediments to partnership and what's really facilitated those partnerships. How's that taking shape?
So I'll say a couple of things, and I think there's two things that came up that I think are very important. Melissa talked about implementation, and then Isaac talked about doing no harm and this notion of defining success. And so there's a couple of things that I think are very important as we all think about doing the work. And I think the first is, how do we show up? If we show up in the work, in our role as leaders, damaged, we end up playing that out in our systems. And so I would say one of the best gifts I got mid-career. Two. Early on in my career, I got to go to the Center for Creative Leadership, which was a phenomenal opportunity. If you ever get a chance to go, I would say it's probably one of the best gifts you can do, because it really helped me figure out all those blind spots that I had. I thought I was wonderful, and I may have been in terms of being able to get the work done, but I had a lot of blind spots. And so it helped me identify those things that were going to absolutely make me blow out my career. That was the first thing. But second, mid-career, I had an opportunity to enter into the Annie E. Casey Foundation Children and Families Fellowship. Phenomenal opportunity to get me right first, to really think about what do I really believe about the work, how do I want to approach getting to scale, how am I showing up, and how do people relate to me in the world. That's important. How do you take up your role in a way that is results-oriented and is going to lead on things? The second is actually having a point of view about a disciplined way of executing. It's not, like you were saying, Isaac, it's not enough just to want to do good. Many of us take up this work and we don't know what we're doing in terms of what we're trying to advance. So for the movement of the Promised Neighborhoods team, the network of 61 communities, we've tried to introduce results-based accountability. This comes specifically out of my work with the Casey Foundation, but they've also helped us with a leadership development program to bring local leaders together to accelerate their work by advancing a disciplined approach. This is huge, folks, because if you don't have a way to ground the work, you have no way of discerning whether the activity is the appropriate activity or not. So regardless of what you may see in Northside Achievement Zone, in Hayward, California, in Washington, D.C., Berea, Kentucky, we believe that if you have a disciplined way of executing to start by doing a few things well, establishing baselines, establishing targets, then really figuring out what are the best evidence-based solutions, and then and only then really forming the table around who can deliver, and then figuring out the specific performance measures for all of those partners. Until you have that, my belief is you don't have anything. And the best example of that I can tell you in our 61-member network, every group that violates that technique ends up in 2 or 3 years coming back and resetting and starting all over again. And then it's really hard because now you got to work out all the politics of having aligned resources, aligned relationships, aligned power. And it all could have prevented if we could have just asked ourselves the couple of questions around results-based accountability. The last thing I'll say is this: if you can't answer the 7 questions of accountability, you're not ready for Six Sigma or any other discipline technique. And so the reality is this: if you can just be basic and answer the 7 questions of results-based accountability, it gives you a way to hold the space for your partnership. Because then the things that Isaac is talking about, the issues that Melissa raised about implementation, and then most importantly, how we show up to Liz's doorstep to help her, is in alignment. We call that being in high action and high alignment. And that's what you want. If you're not doing that, you're showing up in ways that are highly unproductive. So how it's playing out nationally is the way it always plays out. Some folks have said thanks but no thanks. I'm going to do it in an undisciplined way, and they're coming back now. We're into years 2 and 3. They're resetting. Others who have decided they're not going to do that, they're actually hitting their targets. And if they're not hitting their targets, they actually are figuring out why and getting better and stronger. And that's actually what's going to help us build evidence that this policy, in fact, is worthy of becoming permanent. The Promised Neighborhoods program is not a permanent federally authorized program yet. And I don't believe it should be until it can demonstrate that it can deliver. So every year we have to go back to Congress and ask for our appropriation. So you can imagine the problem this creates when you run out and you got everything you've asked for: flexible funding over a sustained period of time, big grants up to $30 million over 5 years. Then we take that money and then we operate in an undisciplined way. And then we get mad when conservatives say we shouldn't invest in this. That's the problem that we're creating on this side of the house. And that's where our partnership with the Casey Foundation helps us create a national environment to try to fix some of that so that we can accelerate local leaders' ability to get results, build evidence for the field, and ultimately, I'll talk about it later, scale and sustain this practice across the country.
Any of you want to weigh in on that piece too? I saw some leans over. No. So I think the question of alignment is a really interesting one to me. I think you have kind of vertical and horizontal partnerships that are required for this work. So you have institutions that might be signing, memoranda of agreement, but you also have sort of the civic engagement and kind of cultural competency piece. So I'm interested to hear more kind of on the ground level. What role does that play when you are working in communities and maybe with organizations staffed by folks who aren't from that community? And what's the importance of code switching in that environment? How do you kind of negotiate spaces that you may not have been operating in before?
He's looking at me. So We actually are a bit blessed to be working mostly with organizations that have people from the community, both in leadership and in other parts of their organization. And so that means that people have multiple connections. It means they have personal connections, that they know people from growing up with people, and that they have connections from school, connections in a variety of ways. And that makes all the difference in the world for trying to understand what's happening in neighborhoods and with families, and what should be next in terms of strategy. It also makes a big difference because there's a lot of programs out there, I think, interested in helping people but not reaching people. And sometimes it's as basic as literally not reaching people. People don't know they exist. And they're a program that people are looking for. And we, as people, hear about things through our personal networks, right? And so as much as we can be using personal networks to share information and to connect people from in and outside of the neighborhood, all the better. So when we did our community organizing in Boston, we did a pretty intensive community organizing process. One of the things people said is around economic development is that they were very interested in opportunities to run their own business, to build on entrepreneurship. A number of people were already operating and making money out of their homes on a variety of projects. People don't always think that, but there's a lot of that going on, and people are earning money that way. And they're interested in formalizing a business, and they said they didn't see resources for it. Well, there's actually quite a few organizations that support people in developing their business. And so one of the things we did was work with one of them to connect through our organizing networks for an entrepreneurship training program. We tacked on a contest with prize money so that people could really get businesses started and launched, and connected them in a network where they could work together. And I think those kinds of things are very important. And it was both cultural competency of the neighborhood and knowledge of the neighborhood, but also outside expertise that was a little bit different. That was about connecting to different kinds of financing. That was about connecting to different kinds of things. And I think both are really important. I'll just say one other thing that I think is important, because I'm just coming back from New York and looking at a community benefits agreement that was just put in place around a new project that's going in New York. And the other thing I think is important about spending time in and outside of the neighborhood for people from there and not from there, and rounding out your knowledge base, is sometimes you don't know how big to dream, right? Sometimes we get into our habits in whatever city we're in about what we can ask for in terms of a community benefit agreement, or in terms of how we can think about a program, and you find out that somebody's asking for a whole lot more and getting it. And then you just figure out how, right? You figure out what were the political networks, what were the social networks, how did that happen, and how do you make that happen in your town? And so we went through a community benefit agreement, signed, agreed, with revenue sharing in significant ways across the life of the project. And I thought, well, it's very important that people in other cities understand the level of revenue sharing that's happening here, and thinking about where it can happen somewhere else. So I say both are important.
Interesting. Lisk has a very, unique and kind of beneficial perspective with the luxury of private capital at your disposal. Yeah. Often that's a luxury that school administrators and teachers don't have. So I'm interested in the communities that may not have an influx of new resources. How are you making this work, doing more with less in a lot of ways, Liz? How have you reached the youth where they are, given that the problems are only growing, but you may not have received a funding? I know the promised neighborhoods aren't as prevalent in your part of Chicago yet, and there are sort of initiatives looking to operationalize partnerships without new funding. What are some of those strategies looking like on the ground?
Yeah. So for us, it's been just, again, trying to build partnerships in Chicago. And so our partners are really critical to our success, because they are able to provide things oftentimes during the school day and outside of the school day that we just don't have the bandwidth to do in the school. In this time of, smaller budgets, do more with less resources, like partnerships are absolutely critical. Not just for providing kids with something to do, but into really expanding their horizons. I think exposure is absolutely key, and I think that oftentimes in schools, and maybe it's communities too, but I see it in schools, not just in Chicago, but as I visited schools in different parts of the country too, it's like sometimes we've stripped out like inspiration within schools, and we're not inspiring children to dream bigger dreams. And so our community partners have really been critical and key in that. So I just think of a couple like Urban Alliance, which actually takes kids, high school seniors, and connects them to with training, which is really important because sometimes people want to do programming but don't want to give kids a training that goes along to actually get them to or help them to be successful. So they give like 6 weeks of training, and the child's actually connected to a corporate partner downtown, actually working in a corporate office, which is huge in that sometimes our kids don't come out of a 3 to 5 mile radius within their whole life. I have students that have come to us that haven't even been in downtown Chicago, and if you know where we are, we're a 20-minute drive from downtown Chicago, but have never been there. And so I think those community partnerships are critical. Programs like Embark that actually take kids, again, small, but to places like Whole Foods. If you've always shopped and got your groceries from the corner store and you've never seen the quick story, I took a student out to eat, a couple students out to eat the other day, and the student had never had asparagus. And I was just, just amazed at sometimes the lack of exposure that kids have. And so those partners become critical in that exposure piece, that inspirational piece as well. And then also in connecting kids to jobs with teenagers. Everyone kind of always focuses on the little ones, which I love the little ones, but the bigger ones are more my deal. And so they want jobs, and so they don't want to go to your fun summer camp that doesn't get paid. They want to actually make some money. They're teenagers, and so having those partnerships to connect kids to jobs and job training has been critical as well. And so really it's all relational, which I think is unfortunate because depending on how good of a principal I am and how I can network or how I can get out there will directly impact what resources my kids receive. And somehow I just believe that is just completely inequitable. And the principal's role, I think, has oftentimes, it's just morphed, and this has now become part of that role, also in terms of raising funds, which I just think I fundamentally have an issue with. I don't believe we should have to privately fundraise for a public school. I believe we should just have access to the resources that we need. So yeah, I hope that answered that.
Of course, yeah, thank you. So being in a school of public policy, the question we often return to is one of scale. And there are programs that have done this work beyond Promised Neighborhoods. You have full-service community schools, 21st century community learning centers, a number of federal funding streams that have been experimenting with this work in different iterations over the years. But a real light bulb hit me in a conversation with Michael a year or two back when he reminded me that it's not a program that's going to solve any of these issues. It's sort of the fundamental way we operate in these communities, and it's sort of a strategy that just is going to have to become pervasive in these communities. So looking beyond any particular line item in the federal budget, any particular ambitious program coming out of a well-funded foundation, what does the future hold for this work? I think the idea of giving the work back to the people is another thing we talk about here a lot. So what does scale look like outside of federal support? When Liz is sitting down with her young people and her community stakeholders in the future, what would that look like ideally in a generation?
So to me, Liz reminded me of something that I call the consciousness of possibility. Because for most of us, when we are in these important roles, we think so small. And we think trendy, and we think sexy. And I can tell you, the work that has to happen right now is not trendy, and it is not sexy. It is the steadfastness of our commitment to deliver. That is the charge. That is just where we're at right now. We've been through the cycles, and that's why you should read Voices from the Field 3. We've done the initiatives, we've done the pilots, we've done all that. But if you really want to get to scale, you're right. Principals should have to be raising money on top of everything else they have to do. We're not a poor nation, and we've got to stop telling this myth that we are when it comes to caring about poor children and children of color. We allow that to stand, and we don't fight back against it. We've got millions of dollars that flow through the city, counties, and states year in and year out in formula dollars. We never ask about using those dollars any differently. When I was in Chicago at HUD, I can tell you, they get over $100 million alone in community development block grant dollars. The city can use those dollars any way they want to. Any way they want to. I can tell you, the way it's used to advance this work is they hold a big community meeting, about 300 nonprofits show up, and then we divvy the money up so that everybody can be happy. The unsexiness of that work is to change that behavior, to actually figure out how do we align those dollars around a core set of results in a place and stick with it until we deliver. That means you gotta wanna fight. That means that you've gotta wanna be courageous in your own leadership. See, talking about this stuff academically, we all will say amen and hallelujah in this room. But in your role, you've gotta take that up in a big way. And so I'll just give you a personal example. As an intermediary organization, meaning that I sit at the national level, it's easy to take this role up and just write papers and come to things like this and just talk. And people will love you, and you really, can build a career really not doing anything but smoke and mirrors. Yeah. Maybe you do a little good, not trying to disparage it, but that's not going to get to what Haling just asked. So we decided to do a couple things at the Institute. We decided to own the same 10 results and 15 indicators that Isaac owns on the ground. That's a huge start for an intermediary because, as you know, we're always worried about attribution. But if I don't own the same 10 results and 15 indicators, one, I've already lost the game in trying to add value to his work because now I'm just caring about appearances. When I ask the question, how do I contribute to those same 10 results and 15 indicators from the perch that I occupy, lead totally different. But it also means that I have to put points of view out there, that I have to risk. So early on, we knew that many of the sites in the Promised Neighborhoods movement were going to go off and spend millions of dollars to build data systems when that's not what was needed. Imagine if you needed to do word processing, you all decided, well, you know what, I know Microsoft Word and Cradle are out there, but I'm just not going to do that. I'm just going to go build it myself because someone gave me money to. Think about the idiocy of that when you're trying to deliver on results.
It happens every day.
It happens every day. And I had to be willing to say that to folks in the network, and folks got really mad. But nevertheless, we went out and bought the national system, saved communities more than $2.5 million a year, can get a community up on it from 3 years to 6 months. But that's an example right there where I had to put my butt on the line. I had to sell this to Jeff Canada and Angela Glover Blackwell. I had just got hired. Remember, we were over in Cavallo Point at Sausalito, and I'm talking about we're going to have national infrastructure, and they laughed at me. And I was sitting here like this, and I felt like a little boy trying to sell something to mom and dad. And I really got mad, and I thought I was going to get fired because I really was fighting back on how are we going to do this work, and we can't even see what the data tells us. But that is an example, folks, that if you want to get to scale, you've got to decide right now what your contribution will be to it. And it is doing some of the work that folks don't want to do. If you think about the federal regulations of the formula dollars that I'm talking about, they haven't been revised since probably the 1970s. They've been amended since, but not structurally changed. They're out of alignment with doing this work. Those are examples of what it takes to get to scale. Realigning those existing dollars around results-based leaders like Liz, like Isaac, like Melissa, to deliver on the results that they can articulate, that is our job, to remove those barriers so that they can do that work. That's not fancy, it's not a silver bullet, but just like there's no silver bullet that you can implement programmatically, there is not one to lead to get to scale. And so this work has to be done. If we don't do it, you're not going to get to scale because you fundamentally don't have anything to sell. You don't have a result story, folks. And so that's why it is important. Scale to me is about you choosing in the positions of power that you will have, how you will take that role up, how you will increase the capacity of your institution to serve. I'm not just at the Institute, the Promised Neighborhoods Institute. I'm thinking about how to help increase the capacity of PolicyLink to serve. That's got to be our job. That has to be our goal. Because then you can enter into this work in some exciting new ways. So the last thing I'll say is this. Just as Liz said, we have to give kids a sense of the possibility. Each and every one of you have to have a sense of the possibility that is nested inside you, and then ultimately have the courage to step into your own power as you take up your roles. When you do that, figuring out ways in which you can contribute to scale will be profoundly exciting, and you will find the possibilities. Without that, you'll probably just end up writing another article about scale that just came one out of the Stanford Social Innovation Review, I believe it was last month. And that'll be a big so what. And so, think about that, because to me, it's no longer, unfortunately, you cannot extend the body of knowledge around this work until we do something different. The field is stuck because the field is afraid to behave different. So we keep defaulting back to writing one more time about scale. Not saying anything new. Look at the citations, folks. The citations are old. Our job is to extend the body of knowledge by actually improving people's lives. So to scale to me means take up your role differently, figure out how you can extend the body of knowledge by actually doing something instead of writing about it.
Thank you. Thank you personally. It's something we grapple with so much here in the academic space. Thinking about how to further the work without, again, kind of rehashing a lot of these arguments and trying to figure out our nuance, but rather sort of building on that to really further the work. I want to make sure we have opportunities for Q&A, so really briefly, I'd like to just go across and make sure that folks got to share any sort of major takeaways, any closing kind of comprehensive thoughts, and then I'll open things up to the audience. So maybe we can start on this side. Yeah.
All right. One thing I just wanted to touch on was just the federal turnaround grant that we received. Their grants are being, given across the country. These grants are 4 years in length, and we know really clearly that the work takes more than 4 years. And so really thinking about how we structure those types of resources. I had a conversation with Arnie Duncan back in October about this, and I was talking to him about just extending it out, less money, but extending it out, and then providing almost like a framework instead of giving schools and institutions, there does need to be some autonomy within it, but giving some more of a framework to support the work, because sometimes in our most challenging schools and that face enormous odds, similar to ours, where you have sometimes kids coming in, on average, the freshman class comes in, about 40% of them are at a 3rd to 4th grade reading level or below, with non-readers mixed in there as well, right? So how do you support that work long term, because it doesn't change overnight in 4 years, and building more of a holistic K through 12 model within communities. So touch on that.
So I guess I will end by saying, and picking up on something Michael said, that there are neighborhoods where we know a lot of resources, federal, state, and local, are all going into the same neighborhoods and into a subsection of families. So San Francisco has done a really good job at looking at who those families are and where those resources are, and thinking about how to use them differently to get to outcomes. Alameda County has done the same thing. They took a look at where they do all their county spending. So for California counties, that means their public health spending, their social services spending, a variety of things. And they said, well, you know what? A huge percentage is going into one neighborhood and has over a number of years. What are the ways that we use those resources differently? And what are we hearing from people about the way those resources are being used and the way they feel the way services feel, and whether or not they're being taken up? And so they decided that one of the things that they learned is that they needed to put more of the resources, particularly resources that are fee for service, that aren't grant based, that are fee for service. You give the service, you get the fee. How do you put those in different hands in different neighborhoods to make sure they're getting done what people want done for themselves and moving forward in their lives? And so I think that there are actually a number of resources out there, particularly for neighborhoods that have what we would call multiple systems failures, right? High contact with justice, high contact with social services, out-of-home placement, all of those things. There are ways to think differently about how we use those resources to be doing this work beyond the grant, existing resources.
So I think this panel's discussion has reminded me about some comments I often give when I'm talking to roomfuls of direct service providers or nonprofits. And normally what I do with those audiences, I ask them 3 questions. I ask them to raise their hand. The first question is, how many of you as a nonprofit or direct service provider have someone that's responsible on your staff that's paid for writing grants, for doing development work, for bringing money in? 90% of the people raise their hand. Then I ask people, okay, same question, how many of you have people on your staff that you're paying to deal with your finance and your accountability, your accounting structure? You have CFOs, something like that, accountants. 90% of the organizations raise their hand. Then I ask, how many of you have within your organization full-time staff devoted to tracking your outcomes, to tracking the success of the work that you do? 10%, maybe, depends on the audience. 10% is usually high. To me, that's such a disconnect. It's almost idiocy that we are willing to support and encourage, and in some instances, we will not even fund organizations that don't have grant writers, that don't have accountability infrastructure in terms of accounting and finance. But no one has ever thought about the resources we need to devote to give people, the staff, the expertise, the funding, the training, everything to be able to have these organizations prove that the work that they're doing is having a positive outcome on the participants they're trying to serve. That, I think, is the big mindset shift that has to happen. So for those of you in the room that are current policymakers or future policymakers, my charge to you is to not forget that. Do not forget, when you are implementing or advocating or pushing for new policy, the resources to all of these direct service providers, to all these organizations, even schools and government entities, because those organizations struggle with doing this as well. Resource, support, give capacity to those organizations so they can prove the effectiveness of what they're doing. Because if not, you really are just throwing money down the drain.
It's been said well. We can go to questions on my end.
All right. So we've got mics on either row, so if folks want to come on out and just form a queue, happy to get going. Start here. And if you don't mind just introducing yourself briefly.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Shara Cates. I am a master's student at Tufts University doing urban environmental policy and planning and child development. So my question is, I do a lot of work now looking at like family and community engagement and kind of the barriers that they face trying to engage in schools. And one of the things I found is that governance plays a big role in this, and like the changes and like governors and mayors and presidents kind of makes people hold their breath when it comes to like things changing. So I guess kind of, can you speak a little bit about that, and like how does that work as far as trying to create sustainability and scalability?
So we believe at the Institute that, you know, since poverty does not know a political season, that we need to be able to build institutions that operate that way. So to me, it's a big so what. We should be able to operate in a Republican administration the same way we can in a Democrat administration. We can do those things. And for us, it means we think about kind of what's the infrastructure that's needed to be built, so that you don't often have to keep rebuilding the infrastructure to do the work. There will be seasons where folks don't want to fund what Isaac is talking about, which is the operational capacity. But it doesn't mean a city can't build that. It just doesn't, it means that everybody doesn't have to have it, but everybody can use it. Businesses do this every day. They may have 1,000 different locations, but it doesn't mean that they've got 1,000 different data systems. It doesn't mean that they haven't figured out how to have a backbone that can manage that work. So for us, it is about figuring out at a national level, how do we help communities have some pieces of national infrastructure that they can ramp on and ramp off regardless of the political season. But it also means that for me, I have to do something that is very important. I have to be able to fundraise very well. And it means that I have to be able to do that and dream very big. So Jeff Canada has tasked us with going out and raising $200 million for the network as a start. That's an exciting piece of professional development for me, but it is the reality of this work that we've got to go out and get it. And so sustainability to me is about, one, finding those new champions out there. They are out there, and we've got to tap into them for this work. But it is also about us getting very smart about the infrastructure that we built so that it will be enduring. And rarely do we think or we organize around enduring things. We use the word sustainability, and I think we should quite frankly stop using it in this sector. First of all, the marketplace isn't structured for sustainability, so we're setting nonprofits up for failure. Most organizations are not funded to be research and development arms where they can go out and come up with some type of social enterprising idea that's going to lose money, and folks would get mad if they saw on their balance sheet that they lost $1 million trying. So this whole notion of sustainability is one of those words. We're like parrots in this sector. We take these words on and we don't understand the implications. Sustainability is not an option to me in this sector. What you can do is try to build the most effective pieces of infrastructure that'll be enduring, and stop using a word that then we don't own. When we talk about sustainability, everybody says it, but nobody wants to own it in the room. Philanthropy doesn't own it, corporations don't own it, and you leave the principal and you leave the nonprofit leaders to own a word that then they can't sell. So it's part of getting rid of the fantasy of these social constructs around the words that we have. That's how we can get there, by getting really real about what is the real work and what do we want to have endure.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'll add one thing, which is I think if you're lucky enough to be in a city where politicians believe that all politics are local, and you've got a strong local coalition and they need to go out and get votes and they need to go out and know what's happening and what people care about in a particular neighborhood, why somebody's fighting about a particular project, what's happening. you have more power, right? So I think that as much as neighborhood coalitions can be pulled together, and neighborhood coalitions can be pulled together cheaper than we think, although, the more resources, the better, but they can be pulled together cheaper than we think. I think the more that you have a constituency that you're speaking for as a leader, and a constituency that is clear on what's going well and can speak to it, and a constituency that is clear on what is not going well and is upfront and real with people about that, I think that you have more power to drive home and hold strong on what your priorities are.
Great.
My name is Errol Henderson. I'm a professor at Penn State. I appreciate what's been said. I want to comment on and ask you a question as well. I want you to respond. I was raised in the housing project, but my question comes from the work I did with some folks who are mothers and fathers of children who've been murdered in Detroit, where I'm from. Clementine Barfield, who started Save Our Sons and Daughters, her 17-year-old son was killed, right? Listen to this woman. She says, my son was a victim, and so was the teenager who killed him. Brenda Muhammad, of Mothers of Murdered Sons in Atlanta, the Sisters of Mothers Rock in LA, and Sister Davis in New York. These women, they built organizations, right? They weren't grant writers, right? They did these organizations for 10 or 15 years. Most of these were black women. Mm-hmm. So so sometimes when I'm hearing brothers saying about these heroes out there are a lot of them out there. It'd be nice to hear their names. Excuse me, I talk loud. I'm the youngest of 13. It ain't personal. Listen here. But so I told him, I'm sorry. But what I wanted to hear was that we used to struggle with the evaluators come in, and I do quantitative analysis at Penn State. How do you know the criteria you're using is not the problem as opposed to the evaluation they have? How do you measure the extent to what didn't happen? It's been the places we're trying to create as peace zones just to get some funders to give you some more paper. I would argue that the criteria that often are used by evaluators are flawed. I had so much of midnight basketball pushed down my throat. I said, we don't do midnight basketball in Detroit. You see what I'm saying? We got this program where we go into the prisons, we go into the rec centers, and we coordinate it through the schools. And when you say the resources are there, the principles right there. You want to do evaluation? Teach the children how to do evaluation. We used to constantly say our business is to put ourselves out of a job and have that sensibility, but raise those images of many of these sisters and brothers who've been doing this for decades. This was she started in 87. That organization lasted for 15 years. Most folks don't even know her name. That's why I raised her name. When you talk about the hero, those heroes, and we sat down with Man Wright, Edelman, Jeff Kennedy when he didn't have no paper, all these folks here. See, so I'm saying to raise these images and say we need to continue to do this because sometimes I come to these conferences, there's such a presentist bias about we just doing this, and I'm saying excellent examples, and I want to draw from them, right? But if we raise these image and interest, we won't have people saying, what do they do in Chicago with all these killings? What did Ms. Barfield do? What did Brenda Muhammad do? What did they do so that the gangs respected them? The people in the community respected them, and how do you evaluate that when they're not answering your surveys? You see what I'm saying? But they know when Marion Stamps going to Cabrini Green after Dantrell Davis's murder, Marion organized the truce. I don't know how you put that on evaluation thing. I'm not knocking you for that, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying to appreciate that our successes are not simply determined by the outcomes that'll get us more budgeting, but the outcomes that are the lived experience of those kids. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, brother. And I think I think it actually does raise an interesting and really relevant question that we didn't touch on, and I wasn't sure if it would be sort of appropriate to raise, but I think Liz has some firsthand experience with sort of responding to this violence. As many folks read a few years back, one of her students, Darian Albert, was killed on the way to school and has sort of catalyzed a national conversation. And I think it would be interesting kind of in response to that comment to reflect on sort of how your community mobilized, and it wasn't a federal initiative. It was families and it was advocates like yourself. What did that look like, Liz?
Yeah, so I think it was just us taking care of us and trying to do right by us. And it probably won't show up in our school metric, and we probably won't get any additional points to raise our level of our school in terms of our school scorecard. But there are so many things that happen within the course of the school day or within the course of that 4-year span and when children are in school that literally change the trajectory of their lives that don't really quote unquote matter when it comes to like rating a school or determining whether a school is successful. And it's really, 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 really unfortunate. And it's not just, I'm not just here speaking on behalf of my school. I think it's schools across Chicago and across the country that this happens in. And I think oftentimes, and this is kind of gets me a little bit upset, is it's often the schools that are most in need, I think sometimes that have the most constraints and boxes in which to operate in, that need the most autonomy and the most flexibility and the most creativity in terms of realizing the incremental success or larger successes that they have, and how that translates into ultimate results for kids.
Thanks.
Halen, can I jump in real quick here? Because I want to offer a quick comment about this. When I think that the whole concept of the evaluation field and this crazy conversation we're having about big data and being data driven, it masks, it's an excuse, and it makes people scared, and people think data is a dirty 4-letter word, which in many ways it is a dirty 4-letter word. And what I encourage people to do when they're in this work, when they're really working with these really hard, intractable issues, is to quite honestly forget what the funders want. I want you to collect information that you think is going to be valuable so that you can better serve your participants. I don't care if that's a data point. I don't care if it's through a survey. I don't care how you collect it or what you collect it. Collect the information that you think is valuable so that you know whether or not you're doing a good job. You collect that first, and you do a good job collecting it, whatever it looks like, and you think of the funders second. Because if you always have in your brain, what do the funders want? What do I need to get the next check to come in the door? How can I get this to be able to spin an angle to write a grant to get more money in? You're doing your work not for your participants, not for your children, not for your parents, not for your community. You're doing it to get more money in the door, and that's the wrong reason. So I encourage people to not use the concept of evaluation or data as this big negative thing, but rather embrace it for what it is. It is a tool to help you better serve your community and your participants better. The concept of measurement and data and evaluation is something I would argue that 99% of people can easily understand. If you understand the concept of dieting, you understand the concept of measurement and evaluation and using data to make change. That's all dieting is. Dieting is evaluation, performance management, data collection, whatever term you use. Everyone understands that. The rest is easy.
Can I just push back on it a little bit? Because I think that, I agree with what you're saying. I think that that data piece, and we can collect data. Like I can say that my school is safer because X. Like we used to have, remember I used to have to get up in the morning. I would check my email every morning as soon as I got up at 5:30, and I was checking not to see if, I'd got an email from the district, but to see, who got shot last night. And so if you look at where we were 4 years ago, where I would get regular emails on this, to where we are now, where we actually just had a student shot last Sunday, but before that we hadn't had anyone shot in a little over a year, which is huge for us. That doesn't show up on a report card, and not, I don't want to say that no one cares about that, but the reality is when the school is being measured, or when I'm going to people for funding, that doesn't necessarily come up. And that's one small thing, or not so small maybe, but that doesn't really factor in to that.
And that's where I think the neighborhood data really matters, because there are ways to talk about a whole neighborhood where that does come up, right? There are ways to say, so for example, a community coalition matters because of a variety of things they've been able to do, and you can actually measure it. So you don't do surveys, but you do some interviews, and you do interviews where people are, where they're willing to meet you. You take it off of coming to you, you put it on going to them, and you hear their stories, and you help use their stories of what they've been able to do to tell the qualitative data story on what has happened because of a coalition or because of a neighborhood. And then when you're following neighborhood data, when you have a coalition that says we care about 5 things in a neighborhood, one of them is safety, one of them is schools, and you have the systems to collect on both, to collect on the safety story and to collect on the school story, then you do get to start telling those stories. And when somebody at the school had helped resolve an issue, you have a place to capture it. And so there's actually people who do that data work now. We have an evaluator that works with us on that. There's actually somebody who's piloting a neighborhood-based data strategy with us now, too, around a particular neighborhood, small group. Most people in Boston, when I started work here and asked people about them, hadn't heard of them at all. Boston Project Ministries in a particular neighborhood, what people from the city would consider a sub-neighborhood of a sub-neighborhood, but they knew everybody on their block. They knew what young people wanted in terms of jobs and connections, and they knew a whole lot of business people in that neighborhood. And so they decided they wanted to attack youth jobs, and so they pulled together a group of youth and a group of business people, and they said, these are the metrics that matter for us for what youth are doing this summer. And Then they went out and they checked all their assumptions and checked prejudices on both sides. So people believed, well, these are small businesses, they're mom and pops, they won't hire anybody who's not family. Found out that was wrong. That actually most of the businesses hired somebody who wasn't family. And found out that a fair number of them would be willing to hire youth. Also found out that there's a huge perception that hiring youth is a big problem, even though only two of the people in the survey really had a very specific instance in which that was the case. And so that neighborhood can then say, okay, so we've got a perception problem with our young people. We need to talk to businesses about that problem. We need to figure out how to make sure they feel supported when they hire our young people. We're going to build up and promote the businesses that do hire our young people. And we're going to work with the youth to make sure they know there are jobs out there. When we sat down, we did the data collection around who's hiring. We had youth sitting in the room right there who said, I didn't know the place around the corner from me was actually looking for somebody right now. Mm-hmm. And those are the kinds of things that when you have local data systems, you can do.
Hi, I'm Dean Polk. You can call me D. I'm from the Mississippi Economic Policy Center. I'm from Mississippi. And so question I have regards that I'm from a rural state, very rural. A lot of what you all are talking about is very urban. Mm-hmm. So how does what you're talking about and what you're espousing work within a Mississippi or an Alabama? Mm-hmm. And I want to talk exclusively from many. I wanted to thank y'all so much, first of all, but I want to talk from the perspective of showing up damaged, because we have a bunch of coalition groups in my state as well, but we're all showing up damaged, and therefore our work is limited in what we're able to do. Yeah. So how do you deal with that? But also, how do you deal with capacity? A lot of the folks that are working on the very issues that we're trying to eliminate and alleviate grew up in Mississippi and are, in many ways, there are the results of an education system that's very poor and vestiges of Jim Crow, and they don't have the capacity to do the type of work, like for instance with the seven-step accountability program. You say that in Mississippi, no chance. No one knows what that is, and so I'd like to get you to Mississippi somehow. But how do you begin to sort of bring this down to a very local, and when I say local, I'm not talking about local area here in the Boston area. I'm talking about Pascagoula, Mississippi, Madison, Mississippi, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Greenville, Alabama, something like that. Thank you.
Brother, I'm glad you're from Mississippi, because my mother is from West Point, Mississippi. Okay. And I spent a lot of time in Mississippi. I just got back from Indianola, Mississippi, working with their Promised Neighborhood. And I would say this. I would say folks can do this work. I think the fallacy of our work is that we've gotten so intelligent that we think we're the only ones who can do it. And that is the problem. And folks can't answer. When you look at those 7 questions, they are basic questions. They're asking people what do they want for themselves, but we often supplant their wisdom for ours and then get mad when it doesn't work out. And so we are showing up damaged, but we can fix that every day. We have to do the work on ourselves every day. Indianola, I'm watching this play out, some of the tensions around race and class. And that's why we partner with the Casey Foundation to do this leadership development program, so we can get people in a space that is safe enough for them to do the tough adaptive work. Because what happens in most communities is the moment you hit those types of road bumps around race, class, culture, and power, we walk away from the table. Or we do even worse. We go out in the parking lot and say what we should have said in the room. And so our job has to be to model what we want. I am that person that came from poverty, and I'm only sitting here by the grace of God, and that some people took me under their wing to show me how you do this work. I came out of high school, I didn't know what to do. I went in the Army because I saw my dad be in the Army, and I was like, well, if I can't do anything else, at least I can go in the Army. And then I started figuring it out along the way. But that's also why I bring a different passion to this work and almost an anger, because quite frankly, I am angry about the work. It does anger me when I see people in Mississippi and other places, especially us of color, those of us from poverty, not championing the work commensurate with our God-given ability. When you come to the work authentically, when you are talking about advancing a result for folks, you'd be surprised how powerful that is. You'd be surprised what the ripple effect of that is in a community. When I go to Mississippi, they don't care whether I'm Dr. McAfee, and I don't either, quite frankly. But what I do know is this. They want results for their children and families just like I do. And if I can humble myself enough to listen to that, I don't need to help them. I need to join them in doing the work that they're already committed to doing. But we enter into this work with these artificial constructs like poor people don't care, poor people don't want to do the work, and then we use evaluation as a proxy to defund. And so this is where what I'm saying about us coming, even in my damaged self, I can still do some good. The last thing I'll say is this. In middle class America and upper middle class America, they don't have the infrastructure that we're asking poor communities to have, and they get funding every day. We don't ask them to do all this for their kids.
That's right.
And so why are we buying all these constructs, all these requirements that then handicap and become a proxy to take money away from poor people? I refuse to play in those games. When I see that happening, I say something about it, folks. You've got to do that in your roles. See, you can't change this problem until you decide you're going to own it, because it is that deep. Like I said, I can run around the country and know all this stuff and absolutely say, well, you know what, this is being videotaped today, so I ain't going to say nothing. You see my point? Right. And so then I end up giving you some more constructs that absolutely are useless to you because they don't work in Mississippi. What works in Mississippi is you having the willingness to, one, commit to the work for the long term, then sit down and actually do the work with community. You can do the code switching that's necessary if they can't. That's your job. Folks, don't make this more complicated than it is. All children want to read. I've never met a mom who said she don't want her kids to be successful. I've never met a dad who said that. Let's start there. Let's get away from results-based accountability. Let's get away from all this other stuff. I can hold that, but my brilliance should be in how simply I can do it and you never even hear the words. Folks, that's when we're operating with some real skill. All this stuff that we've learned in school should be invisible. What should be at the forefront is our authentic capacity to touch people's lives in ways that matter to them.
Excellent, thank you. We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a master's in public administration student here.
And a great member of our planning committee.
But prior to coming here, I was a public defender for about 5 years, and I was a juvenile public defender. And so I saw the breakdown in education in a real way when I was representing kids who, the question was like, I feel like they were at a crossroads, and judges and prosecutors we want like the question between them going to jail versus getting them back in the education system, and everyone was on board but the education system, and I fought and fought. So I kind of want to talk about, if you guys could talk about that, because I think that not only just getting people back into school, but the kind of failing education system within the juvenile justice system. So kind of from your perspectives, how do we deal with that? Because I really think that those kids were at a crossroads, and by not kind of getting them back in leads them down the road of.
So I think it's some of the preventative things that we do for kids before they touch the juvenile justice system, obviously with families, and then also supports and programs that are in school. But I think once children, it's such an unfortunate thing to say, once children kind of exit from the justice system, really figuring out how we're going to support them. And so I think there are some broad strokes with that, but I think there's also then individual ways, because every child is different and needs a different kind of realm of support. And so for us, what it's looked like at our school is that we actually connect with probation officers on a regular basis. So we have these quarterly PO meetings where any of my students that have probation officers, we bring them together. We're talking about the different programs and after school supports, and really trying to leverage our probation officers to work with us so that we can get, Johnny into anger management or into these different, trauma counseling or whatever, because sometimes the PO has more leverage than the school and the parent combined times 7, because the child is more connected to that particular person for obvious reasons. And so leveraging that to get supports and resources for the kid and then building upon that. I think it's also, what I found is, and I mean, research really backs this up too, is children who are, coming out of or within that system oftentimes have huge reading issues, right? And so they're acting out in class and then getting suspended. There's this whole cycle that we all know about. And so really identifying kids before or whenever, when the child's identified, and making sure they get the supports, reading-wise or otherwise, to help them be successful. All kids want to be successful. It's sometimes they, for whatever reason, are embarrassed or these different things. And so just trying to make sure that we're building like a holistic kind of almost like cocoon around them with like all adults involved.
I think we also have work to do for kids who are not connected to school or work. And I think actually we need programs, systems, ways of connecting that are for those kids, that don't rely on school, don't rely on the school district, but are really focused on meeting those kids where they are. So there's two good ones that I know, that I just happen to know personally. One is Roca in Chelsea. And they do a whole lot of street-based outreach as part of connecting to kids and focus on kids who aren't in programs and systems, right?
There's an article in the New York Times yesterday about Roca.
Okay, yes, and they actually have a Pay for Success program now that they're doing, so they're getting more public attention around that. But they've been doing this work for a lot of years and doing it well. A program similar to them out in Oakland, which is where I was and partially modeled on them, is Youth Uprising. Similar thing, really. Not the kids who are in a school program already, not the kids who are in some other program already, the kids who are out on streets on corners, kids who have dropped out of school, and the school might say, we can't find them, so we're not sure they're dropped out, but we know they're 3 blocks down. Those kids, and really focusing on engaging those kids. This is where the cultural competence came in. We tended to hire people from the neighborhood who knew the kids from a variety of angles, and have them come out and make connections with them over time. And you don't need to get them into the building right away for services, but you do need to be connected enough so that eventually you can talk to them about you just can't have 1 foot in and 1 foot out, right? And be safe.
And if I could add one last thing, I think really to really get at the root of what you're talking about and your question is, there needs to be a recognition by everyone in the field that some people, some children, some youth are just going to fail in some instances with some programming, and we need to figure out what the next step is for them, and the next step after that, and be very intentional about it, and not assume that everyone is going to absolutely succeed even if they have a fantastic school, right? There are some people that are going to struggle. What do we have in place to help with those people? And then that second intervention is going to have kids who struggle through that. What's the next intervention behind that? I think very much we lie to ourselves and think that there's a magic, easy solution for all of these problems, and there isn't, and we lose sight of really what we should be doing, which is the bulk of the kids are going to be okay. How do we start dealing with the ones that struggle with the first intervention and the second intervention and the third intervention, and not stop and figure out what's the 20th intervention, and let's think about that, and what's the 21st intervention? Because I think we really, really do lie to ourselves and think that there is a magic solution for all these problems when we are just refusing to do the really hard thinking about how we can continue to help people that face the toughest challenges.
And then to also realize that there are pockets of schools across this country where kids who are on the 20th intervention are all focused in one particular pocket or schools or communities, and how that just complicates the whole situation, and it changes the nature of services that need to be provided.
Well, we have a lot of work to do. I think in a lot of different sectors. We've heard from practitioners, policymakers, folks from the data vantage point. And I think if I can take moderator's privilege with one closing question. We have a room full of really energized young professionals and students, and I'm interested if you had any candid thoughts on folks who are really passionate about this work and who may not know the best point of entry, or maybe trying to think through how to leverage their skills to move the needle here. And as we've heard, there's sort of a variety of sorts of stakeholders that play a role in this work, different kinds of partnerships that have taken hold. So in your opinion, where do you think the next frontier is for this work, and how can sort of our next generation of policy and practitioner professionals really push the work forward? Any calls to action?
There are roles for everyone. There really are. There are roles for people who are fully in research and development and to lift up what works. There are roles for people in policy to be thinking about policy and how it hits the ground. I also am a public administration person. The person who stood up before me was. It's because I believe implementation matters more than anything else. And I made that choice to focus on that. And I think there are roles for people who can move back and forth. And then there's always going to be your professional role and figuring out how you can do things in your professional role. And then there's always going to be who you are. And who you are that is able to see things differently, to be and understand things differently, and to help people who can't figure out how to work with somebody else in the system, help them figure out how, right? There's always a vantage point that you have that is unique and different that can help push forward policy agendas. And so I think that's really important to figure out what your role is, and then to know that sometimes you're not working on a system. Sometimes that one individual that you talked to, that you helped, it mattered, and they moved into that internship that mattered for them, that was finally the one after 5 others that they dropped that mattered to them and that got their spark going. And so sometimes it's just what you do as an individual person and what you encourage others around you to do as individual people that build that network.
I guess go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. I guess that my big push would be to have people stay connected to the work, especially in realms of like people who are in policy. I sometimes wish that, our government, both local, state, and federal, could just come spend not just, the drop-by visit for 30 minutes, but actually spend time getting to know the kids and the community and the context. And I think that would inform decisions and ways in which people view the work and how money is spent and where things get allocated to, just exponentially. And so to spend that time, but then also continue to spend that time, like not just to have that one experience and then don't go back in for the next 10 to 15 years and be relying solely off that experience, because communities, neighborhoods, issues, like things change. And it's so important for us to keep relevant and current in order to best serve our youth, because ultimately the fate of our city and country is dependent upon, the policies, and because it all trickles itself down. What policies are decided in DC or down in Springfield, for Illinois, for us, directly impacts the kids at Finger High School. And then it's like this cycle. They would directly impact like the state and government. It is all connected. And so I think if the adults who make decisions were often better connected, it would just be such a huge push in the right direction. And not just for schools, right, but for how we divvy up economic dollars and how we decide where we're going to invest in economies and in jobs and in people. So that's
Great, thank you.
I think my sort of parting comment is to never forget that no matter how educated you are, no matter how many policy levers you bring, no matter how well positioned you are, all of these issues really are about 2 things. They're about people and they're about communication. And it's important to never forget that. It's, as Michael said, it's knowing when to use jargon and when not to use jargon. It's how you can form personal connections with people, how you can really help them understand the points that you're trying to inform them of, but then also remembering it's a 2-way street and listening and learning from the people that you're working with, right? It is always a 2-way communication street, and to keep in mind that without the people part of it, without the communication part of it, none of this is going to work.
I would say the sooner you can kind of figure out where you want to play, what level, that really can help ground your focus. And then after that, I would say, at least it has helped me to figure out where I wanted to play. So I've always said I may not know the opportunity because you all are talented, and so your problem won't be one of opportunity. It'll be, do you have the ability to actually string together a career that is the legacy that you actually wanted to live? And so to me, I say I want to be at the nexus of power and money to be able to use it and to speak truth to the work that I know is important on the ground. So I get into those places. And so I don't necessarily know where that will be, but I know that. And then I'm very clear about the competencies that I need to develop in order to operate at a senior executive level. And those domains are leading change, leading people, getting results, building coalitions, and business acumen. And so no matter where I go, I know that if I'm, and there's a whole set of sub skills under there. If anybody wants to document, just email it to me and I can share it with you. But that I'm building those skills so that I can do that work. And then the last piece I would say is doing work in multiple sectors really enriches your ability to hold the complexity of the work. And so if you could do those things, I think that they would really help you then be able to contribute in powerful ways.
Thanks so much. So today's conversation has been really helpful for me, and I hope you all feel the same way. I'm hearing a lot about rethinking the way capital flows in our communities, rethinking how we approach partnerships, the way we communicate with each other, both as individuals, as professionals, and as organizations. So a lot of really important takeaways I hope you'll also consider. Next up, we'll be walking across the courtyard to Litzauer, and I hope you have a chance to grab any folks on the panel or in the audience that you haven't had a chance to connect with. And of course, want to give a huge round of applause and extend our gratitude to our panelists today. Great having you here. And before you all go, did want to present you with just a modest token of our appreciation. Have some Kennedy School signature bags for you all.
Yay.
You know, it's the School
Thank
of Policy.
you.
Resources are not endless, but we try to show our gratitude. We'll get to the business school next year. You'll have like 11.
Oh, that's great.
But thanks again, and thanks all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Really good to
These
see
more
you.
often.
I know.
I appreciate it.